A warm welcome to Josephine Kizza from Uganda and Karri Munn-Venn from Canada. And we're going to have a bit of a conversation about the intersections between climate change and gender. What are they? How have Josephine and Karri experienced those? And a little bit about some of the people that they've encountered through their work who are engaging on this issue. What do climate change and gender have to do with one another anyway? What are the connections? Josephine?
Thank you, Suzanne. The two concepts are inseparable. In reference to agricultural production, we all know that 60 to 80% of the labor is provided by women. And women and children are therefore the most vulnerable groups. On the other hand, climate change and gender are mutually reinforcing variables. While women and children are victims on one hand, we all know that on the other hand, they are also contributors to the problem being climate change. Since majority of our people in sub-Saharan African households depend on firewood, and so the women and children are doing great damage to the trees for charcoal burning and bricks making, plus firewood. And additionally, it is the youth and men who are very much involved in the charcoal business, because this is where they get an income. So they continuously cut trees for charcoal burning and also continuously cut trees for burning bricks, getting firewood to burn bricks. So these two move together.
Mm-hmm. So, from your perspective, from where you sit, Karri, what have climate change and gender got to do with each other?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think Josephine and I are in very different contexts. The dynamic here is often that men are still disproportionately, they're overrepresented in governance, in positions of leadership, in decision-making around the frameworks that we work in. And women tend to be, are more likely to be in more precarious situations in terms of either employment or decision-making, or, I mean, of course, we've come a very long way in Canada, but there's still disparities that mean that when there are, extreme weather events or other impacts of climate change, it's often women that are on the front lines of that, and that have to deal with how to navigate around that as well.
So both from an advocacy point of view and from a program point of view, where does gender fit into the climate change discussion?
Mm-hmm. If we're not really mindful and careful about how we approach climate solutions, there's a real risk that women will be negatively impacted in that context as well. So one of the major issues that we've been looking at here in Canada is the move away from a fossil fuel driven economy and the building of a cleaner, greener economy. It's really about making sure that those who will be negatively impacted from a move away from fossil fuels don't solely bear the brunt of that shift. But what that can look like sometimes in the way that it is articulated is that it means that these, often young white men, the focus is on making sure that they remain gainfully employed, which is of course important, but it doesn't factor in the fact that women are underrepresented in the energy sector in Canada. When they are part of the energy sector in Canada, they tend to be paid I think it's about 70% of what men in the same sector make. They're often overrepresented in the supporting services, and those sectors aren't necessarily taken into account when we talk about, or when you look at a just transition from that really sort of core definition of moving workers from one sector to another.
It's very interesting that you talk about getting a complete picture, of who is impacted by both by climate change generally, but also by the changes that need to happen as we move away from a fossil fuel economy. And Josephine, I was interested in your comments about women, both as farmers who are impacted by climate change, but also as in a way the generators and burners of firewood, of the sort of Ugandan equivalent, I suppose, of fossil fuels here in Canada. Can you just say a little, Josephine, about in addressing the issue of deforestation, that is the cutting of trees for fuel and for charcoal, is St. Jude trying to respond to that in some way?
That is our major focus before the COVID-19 pandemic and up to today, because the COVID-19 pandemic brought back to rural areas so many people that lived in the urban areas. From the city, they all came back to the rural areas. And now the biggest issue came up, and that was deforestation. You cannot find many trees, grown-up trees. Most of them have been cut down because women had to cook extra food for all the teams that came from the city to live in the rural areas. So in our last 3 years, we are concentrating a lot on agroforestry, and every group that we work with, we must start by sensitizing them to address this issue of deforestation. So we are coming up with different methods, techniques of conserving the energy, training the women how to use briquettes, much as women and youth and plus the children are doing, the major participants in climate change resilience. They have no control over the land. Therefore, the sustainability of any climate change project or program in our area greatly depends on how well gender issues are addressed.
Karri, just wondered if you might respond. I mean, hearing Josephine speak about the issue of land and women's ownership of land, an experience you were mentioning earlier that you'd had in terms of that relationship here in Canada.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Suzanne. One of the things that I recently learned from a conversation specifically with women in agriculture is it's different in the sense that women can and do buy and own land for agriculture here. But the situation when women marry into a farming family can be quite challenging, because there are issues in terms of the farm is often still owned by their in-laws, and it's unclear as to what ownership will look like for their spouse, and they're often, I think, kind of kept on the outside of that, in part just because family dynamics, I think, no matter where you go, can be somewhat tricky. But there is this separation. So even if women work on the farm and are deeply involved in the agricultural operation, in the situation of marrying into farming, they're much less likely to have an ownership stake.
Interesting. And Josephine, you've worked with women farmers for many years. I'm wondering if there's an experience with a woman or a group of women that speaks to this issue of, that highlighted for you this issue of the connection between climate change and gender?
One lady in one of our farmers groups, there is a lady, Amelia. She has been attending our trainings for a number of years. And yes, during, she is a lady who stays home with the children most of the time. Her husband stays in the city and works there, so he comes home regularly. One time after the pandemic, the husband came home and found that this lady had put into practice most of what we are giving them, training them as mitigations to the climate change issues. And one of the things that the practices she had put into practice was tree planting. She had almost covered 1 acre of their land with the rows of trees, multi-purpose trees, and also had dug some trenches to control the soil erosion, water and soil erosion measures. So when the husband came home, he was furious. He didn't want to see these practices. He really quarreled and was not happy. The trees were growing very well, and the husband thought it was a wastage of land. So he made, it was a real fight until he cut down most of the trees and asked the wife to cover all the trenches because the land was destroyed in his sense. Until this lady ran to us to ask for advice. And so when we went to the home, we had to handle it very carefully. The husband listened to us. And he said, but the wife, I accepted she was in your groups, she had the trainings. Other things were good, well done, but the trees and the trenches was not my intention. I had a plan for my land. So from that time, we knew and we learned that it was an error. It has to be, the husbands have to be around, especially when we are doing a needs assessment, and then also to include them in the trainings so that they come to understand. From that time, he has always been attending the trainings, and today I must tell you, he's one of our ambassadors in the area because he now knows what it means, what trees mean, and now the conservation of soil and land. The lesson we got was that we have always to include both men and women, where possible, even the children in the families when we are planning and when we are training these farmers. So this was a great lesson to us, and this has also helped us in other new areas where we are going now.
That's such a good example, Josephine, and such an important lesson. I think we tend to equate gender with women, but gender includes men as well.
So I've spent some time connecting with other women who also raise sheep across Canada. And in the West, of course, last summer, there was extreme drought, which during the summer had some issues in terms of the access to pasture and to grazing land for the animals. But where it really started to hit home was around this time last year when these women sheep farmers were getting ready for winter, and there was so little hay available that there were instances where I knew of women who had to sell some parts of their flock because they couldn't afford to buy hay to feed them through the winter. Well, they are able to adjust sort of in the short term to their economics. Longer term, they have fewer resources.
What I hear from both of you is, and partly why we posed the question, is that there's so much we can learn from one another.
I'm just very much humbled by Karri's presentation, and I've learned a lot, especially knowing that even people from developed countries like yours, like Karri, is still interested in helping, getting involved in climate change, because most people do not even give thoughts on this. So when I hear what Karri is doing, I'm so much humbled and encouraged to help my fellow farmers more. Thank you, Karri, and thank you everyone for your presentation.
Well,
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Josephine.
Josephine.